They called it the City of Blood. A savage kingdom buried in the jungles of West Africa, ruled by primitive kings who knew nothing of civilization. That was the story Europe told itself. But when British soldiers marched through the gates of Benin City in 1897, they found something that shattered every assumption they carried. Streets wider than those in London, laid out in mathematical precision, walls taller than any fortress in Europe, and artwork so sophisticated, so technically perfect, that European museums would spend the next century lying about where it came from. This is not a story about discovery. It is a story about erasure, about a kingdom so advanced that its existence became an inconvenience to the narrative of Western superiority about engineers who mapped the cosmos while Europe was still burning witches, about scientists who mastered metallurgy that wouldn't be replicated in the West for another 200 years, and about the systematic destruction of evidence that would prove, beyond any doubt, that Renaissance Europe was not the pinnacle of human achievement. The year is 1485. Christopher Columbus has not yet sailed. The printing press is barely 40 years old. In Europe, most cities are chaotic tangles of narrow alleys, open sewers, and wooden structures packed so tightly that fires regularly consume entire districts. There is no concept of urban planning, no sanitation systems. Disease spreads through populations like wildfire because no one understands the basic principles of hygiene or infrastructure. But in West Africa, in what is now southern Nigeria, something extraordinary exists. A city that covers an area larger than London. A metropolis enclosed by walls that stretch for over 10,000 miles, longer than the Great Wall of China. These are not crude earthworks. They are sophisticated defensive structures, some sections rising over 50 feet high, built with precise mathematical calculations that account for weight distribution, erosion patterns, and defensive angles. Inside these walls, Benin City hums with organized complexity. The streets form a grid system radiating from the royal palace at the center, each avenue perfectly straight, each intersection calculated to allow maximum flow of movement and commerce. The main boulevards are wide enough for multiple lanes of traffic, not the cramped, winding paths of European medieval towns, but genuine urban highways designed for efficiency. Every street has a drainage system. Channels carved into the ground carry away rainwater and waste, preventing the flooding and filth that plague European cities. The Edo people who built this understand something that Europeans will not grasp for another 300 years. That water management is the foundation of urban civilization. That disease spreads through contaminated water. That engineering is not just about building up, but about moving resources efficiently through a system. The houses are not random. They are organized into wards, each one designated for specific guilds and professions. The bronze casters live in one district, the ivory workers in another. The blacksmiths, the weavers, the doctors, each group clustered together in communities that allow for knowledge sharing, apprenticeship, and the systematic advancement of their craft. This is not accidental. This is planned, deliberate, a recognition that specialization drives innovation, and that innovation requires structure. At the heart of the city stands the royal palace, and it is here that the true genius of Benin becomes visible. The palace complex is massive, covering an area equivalent to several city blocks in modern terms. But size is not what matters. What matters is the precision. The palace is built around a series of courtyards, each one serving a specific ceremonial or administrative function. The walls are decorated with bronze plaques, thousands of them, each one a masterpiece of metallurgical art. These plaques are not decorations. They are records. Historical documentation cast in metal, depicting the lineage of the Oba, the great king, and the major events of the kingdom's history. They show processions, battles, diplomatic meetings with foreign powers. They show the faces of Portuguese traders who arrived in the 1480s. Their features captured with such accuracy that historians centuries later would be able to identify their clothing, their weapons, their social rank. This is a civilization that understands the importance of documentation, of preserving knowledge across generations. The bronze casting technique used in Benin is called lost wax casting, and it is breathtakingly sophisticated. The process requires understanding chemistry, physics, temperature control, and artistic vision. A sculptor first creates a detailed model in wax, capturing every tiny feature, every expression, every fold of cloth. This wax model is then covered in multiple layers of clay, creating a mold. When the clay hardens, the entire structure is heated. The wax melts away, lost, leaving behind a perfect negative space inside the clay. Molten bronze is poured into this space, filling every microscopic detail. When it cools, the clay is broken away, revealing a bronze sculpture that replicates the original wax model with perfect fidelity. This is not simple metalwork. This requires kilns that can reach temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. It requires an understanding of metallurgical ratios, the precise mixture of copper and tin that creates bronze with the right hardness and malleability. It requires knowledge of thermal expansion, cooling rates, structural stress. European bronze workers in the 1400s cannot produce work of this quality. They lack the technical knowledge, the mathematical precision, the scientific understanding. But in Benin, this knowledge exists. It is taught, passed down through guilds where master craftsmen train apprentices in a systematic, rigorous education that takes decades to complete. The bronze casters are not just artists, they are engineers, chemists, scientists working in metal. The Portuguese arrive in 1485, and what they find staggers them. João Afonso de Aveiro, the first European to reach Benin, writes back to Lisbon describing a city that rivals anything in Europe. He describes streets so wide that multiple wagons can pass side by side, buildings with elaborate architecture, markets filled with goods from across Africa and beyond. He describes meeting the Oba, the divine king, in a palace that makes Portuguese royal residences look modest by comparison. The Portuguese want trade. They want access to Benin's resources, pepper, ivory, palm oil. But more than that, they want the bronze. They have never seen metalwork of this quality. European collectors will pay fortunes for these pieces. But the Oba is not interested in selling his kingdom's art. He is interested in establishing diplomatic relations between equals. He sends ambassadors to Lisbon. He proposes trade agreements that benefit both kingdoms. He does not bow. He does not subjugate. He negotiates from a position of strength. This confuses the Portuguese. They are accustomed to encountering societies they can easily dominate. Technologically inferior peoples who can be colonized, converted, controlled. But Benin is none of these things. Benin has military strength, political organization, economic power. The Oba's army is disciplined, well-equipped, and numbering in the tens of thousands. The kingdom's wealth is staggering. This is not a primitive tribe. This is a sophisticated state with infrastructure, governance, and cultural achievements that equal or exceed anything in Europe. For the next 400 years, Benin maintains its independence. European powers come and go, Portuguese, Dutch, British, each one trying to establish dominance, and each one forced to negotiate as equals because Benin has the strength to resist conquest. The kingdom grows. It expands its territory. It absorbs neighboring peoples not through brute force, but through cultural assimilation, offering the benefits of Benin's political stability, its economic opportunities, its technological advantages. The city continues to evolve. New buildings rise. The walls are extended, encompassing more territory. The street grid expands outward from the palace in concentric circles, each new district planned with the same precision as the original. Engineers survey the land, calculating grades and drainage patterns. Architects design structures that can withstand the heavy rains of the tropical climate. Urban planners organize space to accommodate a growing population while maintaining order and efficiency. The guild system becomes more sophisticated. The bronze casters develop new techniques, creating ever more intricate works. They begin experimenting with different alloys, discovering that adding small amounts of other metals can change the properties of bronze, making it harder or more malleable, or giving it different colors when polished. This is metallurgical science. Experimental research conducted with systematic rigor. The ivory workers achieve similar mastery. They learn to work the massive elephant tusks that come from the interior forests, carving them into elaborate sculptures and ritual objects. The level of detail they achieve is extraordinary. Entire scenes carved into a surface the width of a finger, with dozens of human figures, each one with individual facial features, clothing, weapons. This requires tools of incredible precision. It requires optical understanding, the ability to perceive and replicate tiny details. It requires patience and skill built over decades of practice. The blacksmiths forge weapons and tools using techniques that will not appear in Europe for centuries. They understand carbon content in iron. They know that heating iron and plunging it into water rapidly, quenching, makes it harder but more brittle, while slow cooling makes it softer but tougher. They know how to layer different types of metal to create blades that have a hard edge for sharpness, but a flexible spine to prevent breaking. This is materials science. Sophisticated understanding of molecular structures, achieved through empirical observation and experimentation. But perhaps the most remarkable achievement in Benin is something most visitors never notice: the astronomical gates. At strategic points in the city walls, massive gateways are constructed, not just for defense but as astronomical instruments. These gates are positioned and angled to align with celestial events. During the equinoxes, the sun rises through one gate and sets through another, its light traveling perfectly along the main boulevard to illuminate the palace. During solstices, different gates channel sunlight into specific courtyards where ceremonies are held. This is not accident. This is precision engineering based on astronomical observation. The architects of Benin have mapped the movement of the sun across the sky throughout the year. They understand the Earth's axial tilt. They have calculated the angles needed to align structures with celestial events months in advance. They are doing astronomy, mathematical calculation, applied science, and they are doing it centuries before Galileo will point a telescope at the heavens, centuries before Newton will describe the laws of motion, centuries before European universities will teach that the Earth moves around the sun. In Benin, this knowledge already exists. It is built into the architecture. encoded in stone and earth. The knowledge systems in Benin are not written in books. They are transmitted orally through the guild system, from master to apprentice. But this does not make them less sophisticated. The apprenticeship system in Benin is rigorous. A young person entering a guild will spend years learning the basics, then more years mastering techniques, then more years studying under a master, absorbing not just the practical skills, but the theoretical knowledge, the why behind the how. Why does bronze flow better at certain temperatures? Why do certain types of wood carve more smoothly than others? Why do structures built at certain angles withstand earthquakes better? This is scientific thinking. Hypothesis and experimentation, observation and analysis. The accumulation of knowledge across generations, each one building on the discoveries of the previous. It is exactly what is happening in Renaissance Europe, in the universities and workshops. Except in Benin, it is happening earlier, on a larger scale, with more systematic organization. The medical knowledge in Benin is equally advanced. Edo doctors understand surgery. They perform procedures to remove tumors, set broken bones, even conduct cesarean sections, cutting into the abdomen to deliver babies when natural birth is impossible. European surgeons in the 1500s are still using techniques from ancient Rome, still believing that illness is caused by imbalances in bodily humors, still prescribing bloodletting as a cure for everything from fever to cancer. But in Benin, doctors understand anatomy. They know that the heart pumps blood through the body. They know that infection can enter through wounds and must be prevented by cleaning injuries with specific plant extracts that we now recognize as natural antibiotics. They know that certain diseases spread through contact and that isolating sick patients can prevent epidemics. They are practicing evidence-based medicine, adjusting treatments based on what works rather than what ancient texts claim should work. The pharmacology is sophisticated. The forests around Benin contain thousands of plant species, and Edo medical practitioners have tested them systematically over centuries. They know which plants reduce fever, which ones stop bleeding, which ones ease pain, which ones can induce labor or prevent pregnancy or treat infections. They have created a vast botanical knowledge system, passed down through families of healers, each generation adding new discoveries. When Europeans finally gain access to this knowledge in the 1800s, they will discover that dozens of Edo plant remedies contain compounds that modern pharmaceutical companies will later isolate and synthesize. Quinine for malaria, reserpine for high blood pressure, physostigmine for glaucoma. The Edo already knew these plants worked. They had been using them for hundreds of years. European science simply rediscovered what African science had already found. The textile industry in Benin produces fabrics that amaze European traders. The Edo have perfected dyeing techniques that create vibrant, permanent colors. Deep reds, brilliant blues, rich purples. These are not simple vegetable dyes that fade in sunlight. These are complex chemical processes involving multiple steps, mordants to fix colors into fabric, careful temperature control during dyeing. The chemistry is sophisticated. European textile manufacturers will not achieve comparable quality until the Industrial Revolution introduces synthetic dyes in the 1800s. The weaving itself is an art of mathematical precision. Edo weavers create complex geometric patterns, repeating designs that require counting threads, maintaining tension, executing sequences of movements with perfect consistency across thousands of repetitions. One mistake ruins the entire pattern. This is not casual craft. This is disciplined execution of complex algorithms. The weavers are performing calculations, following formulas, even if they do not describe it in those terms. The economic system in Benin is equally sophisticated. The kingdom has a currency system based on standardized brass rods, manillas, that allow for consistent pricing and trade. There are markets organized by commodity type, with designated spaces for different goods. There are trade regulations enforced by the OBA's officials, preventing fraud and ensuring fair weights and measures. There is taxation, collected systematically to fund public works, the maintenance of roads and walls, the construction of new buildings, the support of the royal court and military. This is a functioning state economy with fiscal policy and trade regulation. It is more organized than most European kingdoms of the era, where taxation is haphazard. Trade rules vary by region, and economic policy is whatever the local lord decides on any given day. Benin has bureaucracy, administrative systems, record-keeping, governance structures that separate military, religious, and economic functions. The religious system is complex, with multiple deities and elaborate ritual practices. But it is not chaotic. There is theology, systematic thinking about the nature of the divine, the relationship between gods and humans, the moral obligations of individuals and communities. There are priests who train for years to master ritual procedures, memorizing vast amounts of oral tradition. There are shrines and temples built according to specific architectural principles, designed to create certain acoustic effects or channel light in particular ways during ceremonies. The cosmology is sophisticated. The Edo understand the world as organized by natural laws, patterns that govern everything from the movement of stars to the growth of plants to the behavior of humans. They see connections between things that European natural philosophers are only beginning to recognize. They understand ecology, that animals and plants exist in interconnected systems, where the removal of one species affects all the others. They practice conservation, limiting hunting in certain areas to allow animal populations to recover, rotating agricultural fields to prevent soil exhaustion. This is systems thinking, understanding complexity, recognizing that the world operates through relationships and feedback loops rather than simple cause and effect. European science will not develop this level of ecological thinking until the 20th century. But in Benin, it is already integrated into social practice, into religious belief, into the way people interact with the natural world. The military system is highly organized. The Oba commands an army divided into specialized units: infantry, archers, cavalry. Each unit has specific training, specific equipment, specific tactical roles. Officers rise through a merit-based system, demonstrating competence in battle and leadership ability. There are military academies where young men train in weapons use, tactics, strategy. There are war games where units practice coordinated maneuvers. There is military theory, principles of warfare passed down and refined across generations. The weapons technology is advanced. Benin blacksmiths produce swords with quality comparable to European steel. They forge spears with points that can pierce armor. They create elaborate decorative weapons for ceremony and simpler, more utilitarian weapons for actual combat. They understand the difference between what looks impressive and what actually works in battle. When Europeans bring firearms in the 1500s, the Edo quickly adopt and adapt the technology. They learn to cast cannon. They manufacture gunpowder. They train units of musketeers who can fire in coordinated volleys. Within decades, Benin's military has integrated firearms while maintaining its traditional weapons, creating a flexible fighting force that can respond to different tactical situations. This is technological adaptation, the ability to evaluate new innovations, understand their strengths and weaknesses, and integrate them into existing systems. It is the mark of a sophisticated society, one that is confident enough in its own knowledge to adopt foreign ideas that work while rejecting those that do not. By the 1700s, Benin is at the height of its power. The city has grown to house over 100,000 people, making it one of the largest urban centers in the world. The walls have been extended multiple times, now enclosing an area that dwarfs most European cities. The palace complex has expanded to include dozens of courtyards, each one decorated with bronze plaques and carved pillars. The guilds have multiplied, new specializations emerging as knowledge deepens and technology advances. But something is changing in the world outside Benin. European powers are growing stronger. They have colonized the Americas, extracting vast wealth in gold and silver. They have developed new weapons, more accurate firearms, more powerful artillery. They have built large navies capable of projecting military power across oceans. And they have developed something even more dangerous, an ideology that justifies conquest. The belief that European civilization is superior, that European people have the right, even the duty, to dominate other societies for their own good. This ideology requires evidence. It requires proof that non-European peoples are inferior, less intelligent, less capable, less advanced. And this creates a problem. Because places like Benin exist, sophisticated African kingdoms with technology and culture that equal or exceed Europe's. These kingdoms are inconvenient. They contradict the narrative. They suggest that maybe Europeans are not inherently superior. Maybe the technological advantages Europe has gained, gunpowder, ocean-going ships, industrial machinery, are historical accidents rather than proof of genetic or cultural supremacy. So, the narrative shifts. European writers begin describing African kingdoms in different terms. They acknowledge the buildings, the art, the organization, but they explain it away. They claim that African civilizations must have been built by outside influences. Maybe the Egyptians came south. Maybe there was a lost tribe of Israel. Maybe Phoenician traders. Any explanation that allows Europeans to avoid admitting that Black Africans built sophisticated civilizations on their own. When these explanations are not enough, European writers simply lie. They describe African cities as primitive villages. They claim African art is crude and simplistic. They ignore evidence of technology and science. They create an image of Africa as a dark continent, frozen in prehistory, waiting for European civilization to enlighten it. This fabricated image serves a purpose. It justifies the slave trade. If Africans are primitive, then enslaving them is not a crime. It is bringing them into contact with superior civilization. It justifies colonization. If African societies are backward, then conquering them is not conquest. It is a civilizing mission, a moral duty. The lies become policy. Policy becomes action, and action becomes atrocity. The British arrive in Benin in force in the late 1800s, during the scramble for Africa. European powers are carving up the continent, drawing borders, claiming territories. Britain wants control of the palm oil trade, and Benin controls the palm forests. The Oba refuses to submit to British authority. He maintains that Benin is an independent kingdom, not a colonial possession. He has treaties with Britain recognizing this independence. He has diplomatic relationships going back centuries. He has the legal right to sovereignty. None of this matters. British officials decide that Benin must be conquered. They need a justification, some incident that can be portrayed as aggression requiring military response. In 1896, a British diplomatic mission approaches Benin during a sacred religious festival when the city is closed to outsiders. The Oba sends word that they should wait, that they can enter after the ceremonies are complete. The British ignore this. They march toward the city anyway. They are ambushed on the road. Most of the British party is killed. It is not clear who orders the attack, whether it is rogue military units, local chiefs acting independently, or an actual command from the Oba. It does not matter. Britain has its justification. The newspapers in London scream about savage Africans murdering diplomats. The public demands retaliation. The military is given authorization to launch a punitive expedition. In February 1897, a British force of over 1,200 soldiers, armed with modern rifles and artillery, advances on Benin City. The Edo army attempts to defend the walls, but they are outgunned. British artillery pounds the gates. British infantry storms through the breaches. By the time the Oba orders retreat to prevent further slaughter, the British are inside the city. What happens next is not military necessity. It is not tactical advantage. It is systematic destruction. British soldiers are given orders to loot the city. They are told to take anything of value, artwork, ivory, jewelry, anything that can be sold. The bronze plaques are ripped from the palace walls. Carved ivory tusks are hauled away. Ceremonial objects made of gold and silver are seized. The soldiers work methodically, room by room, stripping the palace of centuries of accumulated art. Then they set fires. The palace burns, the buildings burn, entire districts of the city burn. For days, Benin City is consumed by flames. The wooden structures, houses, workshops, shrines are reduced to ash. The clay buildings crack in the heat. The bronze casters' forges are destroyed. The libraries of oral knowledge, the masters who held centuries of learning in their memories, scatter into the countryside or die in the flames. British officers photograph the destruction. The images show a city in ruins, smoke rising from collapsed buildings, streets littered with debris. But they also show something else. They show the bronze plaques being carried out. They show the architectural sophistication of the buildings, even in ruins. They show the wide streets, the organized layout. They show evidence of exactly what the British are trying to deny, that this was a highly advanced civilization. The looted bronze plaques arrive in Britain by the thousands. They are distributed to museums, sold to private collectors, auctioned to the highest bidders. And immediately, a problem emerges. The quality is too good. The technical sophistication, it's undeniable. European art experts examine them and reach an uncomfortable conclusion. These are masterpieces. The craftsmanship rivals the best bronze work ever produced in Europe. The artistic vision is sophisticated, nuanced, powerful. This is not primitive art. This is high art, world-class art. But this cannot be admitted. If the British public learns that the savages they just conquered were producing art of this quality, the entire justification for the conquest collapses. If Benin was this advanced, then the punitive expedition was not a civilizing mission. It was the destruction of a sophisticated culture. It was cultural genocide. so a different story is constructed. The bronze plaques, European experts claim, must have been made by Europeans. Perhaps Portuguese traders taught the technique to Benin artists. Perhaps the plaques were actually made by European craftsmen living in Benin. Perhaps they were imported from Europe and merely stored in the palace. Any explanation that avoids the obvious truth that African artists created these masterpieces using African knowledge and African skill. The curator at the British Museum, where many of the plaques end up, writes that the bronzes show Portuguese influence and could not have been made by pure-blooded Negroes. The theory is repeated in academic journals, in museum catalogs, in textbooks. It becomes accepted fact, despite having no evidence to support it. Despite the fact that the lost wax casting technique used in Benin predates Portuguese arrival by centuries. Despite the fact that the bronze composition is distinctly African, using local copper and tin in ratios different from European bronze. Despite the fact that similar bronze works have been found throughout West Africa, all predating European contact. The lie spreads. Museums around the world acquire Benin bronzes and display them with labels describing them as influenced by European contact, or possibly made by European craftsmen. The narrative takes hold. Africa had no sophisticated civilizations. Any evidence of advancement must be explained by outside influence. African people were and are culturally inferior. Back in Benin, the city struggles to recover. The Oba has been exiled. The British install a colonial administration. The guild system is dismantled. The British do not want organized groups of craftsmen who might resist colonial authority. The bronze casters are scattered, their knowledge fragmented. Many of the master craftsmen died in the invasion or its aftermath. The ones who survived have no apprentices to train, no royal patronage to support their work, no guild structure to preserve and transmit their knowledge. The street grid is still visible, but the maintenance stops. The drainage systems clog with debris from the burned buildings. The walls begin to deteriorate, with no organized effort to repair them. The astronomical gates remain, but their purpose is forgotten as the ceremonies they served are banned by Christian missionaries. The city, once a marvel of urban planning and engineering, begins a slow decline into colonial neglect. British administrators write reports describing Benin as a backward place requiring development. They do not mention that the infrastructure they find, the roads, the walls, the organized districts, were built by the very people they claim are incapable of self-governance. They do not mention that the city was more advanced before the British burned it than most British colonial towns being built in Africa. They do not acknowledge that they are presiding over decline, not development. The oral histories are disappearing. The guild masters who survived the invasion are aging, and with the guild system destroyed, there are no formal apprenticeships to pass knowledge to the next generation. Some information is preserved within families, fathers teaching sons in secret, away from colonial oversight. But much is lost. Complex techniques refined over centuries are forgotten in a single generation. Astronomical knowledge encoded in architecture becomes mysterious. Medical treatments using rare plant combinations are lost when the practitioners die without passing on the recipes. This is not natural decay. This is engineered erasure. The British colonial system is designed to replace indigenous knowledge with European knowledge. Christian missionaries banned traditional religious practices, destroying the context in which much scientific knowledge was embedded. British schools teach English history, English science, English literature, with the implicit message that African knowledge is worthless superstition. Colonial administrators dismiss traditional governance systems, imposing British law and administration. Economic policies are designed to extract resources for British benefit, destroying local industries that might compete with British manufacturing. Within 2 generations, most people in Benin do not know their own history. They have been taught that they had no history, that civilization arrived with the Europeans. They walk past ruins of massive walls without knowing who built them or why. They see bronze plaques in British museum publications without realizing their own ancestors created them. The erasure is so complete that when scholars finally begin investigating Benin's history seriously in the mid-20th century, they are dismissed as romanticizing Africa, inventing achievements that could not possibly have existed. But the evidence is still there. The walls can be measured. They are real. They are massive. They are older than European contact. The bronze plaques exist in museums. They can be chemically analyzed, their composition compared to known European bronze, their technique examined. The street layout of old Benin City can be mapped. It shows deliberate planning, mathematical precision. Portuguese written records from the 1500s describe a sophisticated city with advanced organization. Slowly, reluctantly, the truth begins to emerge. Archaeologists excavating in Benin find evidence of a city that matches Portuguese descriptions. They find the remains of the massive walls. They find pottery, tools, building foundations, all predating European contact by centuries. They find evidence of iron smelting dating back over 2,000 years. They find glass beads manufactured locally, not imported from Europe. They find the remains of the royal palace, its layout matching the descriptions in oral histories. In the 1950s and 60s, as African nations gain independence, African scholars begin reclaiming their history. They interview elders who remember the stories passed down from their grandparents. They study the physical evidence with new eyes, not filtered through colonial assumptions. They compare accounts from different sources, Portuguese records, Dutch records, British records, looking for consistencies that reveal truth beneath propaganda. What emerges is a picture of a civilization that was, in many ways, more advanced than Renaissance Europe. The urban planning was superior. Benin's street grid and sanitation systems surpassed anything in European cities of the era. The metallurgy was more sophisticated. European bronze casters could not replicate the quality of Benin bronzes until the 20th century. The political organization was more stable. Benin maintained a consistent government structure for over 600 years, while European nations lurched through wars and revolutions. The medical knowledge was more empirical, based on observation and testing rather than ancient texts and religious dogma. This is not romantic exaggeration. This is documented fact. But it contradicts everything Western education has taught about Africa. It suggests that the story of human progress is not a simple line from primitive Africa to civilized Europe. It suggests that different societies developed different strengths, that innovation happened in many places simultaneously, that technology and knowledge flow in multiple directions, rather than from one superior source outward to inferior recipients. The revelation is uncomfortable. It means re-examining assumptions about race, about intelligence, about cultural capacity. It means acknowledging that colonialism destroyed sophisticated civilizations, not just primitive tribes. It means recognizing that much of European advancement came from appropriating knowledge from other cultures, from African metallurgy, from Asian mathematics, from Islamic astronomy, and then erasing the sources of that knowledge. The Benin bronzes become a symbol of this larger story. They sit in museums across Europe and North America, labeled as artifacts from a primitive culture, displayed next to European Renaissance art, as if the two existed in different evolutionary stages. But anyone who examines them closely can see the truth. The technical quality is equivalent. The artistic vision is equivalent. These are not the products of a primitive culture. They are masterworks created by a highly advanced civilization. In the 21st century, Nigeria begins demanding the return of the Benin bronzes. The argument is straightforward. These objects were looted during an illegal invasion. They are stolen property. They belong to the people whose ancestors created them. By any principle of justice or international law, they should be returned. European museums resist. They make various arguments. The bronzes are better preserved in European museums. Nigeria lacks the facilities to properly care for them. The bronzes are part of world heritage and should remain accessible to international audiences. Returning them would empty European museums of their African collections. Each argument reveals the underlying assumption that European institutions are better stewards of African culture than Africans themselves. That preservation matters more than justice. That European access to African art is more important than African connection to their own heritage. It is colonialism in a different form, cultural colonialism. The assertion that Europe has the right to possess and control African culture, even after formal political colonialism has ended. Some museums begin to compromise. They offer long-term loans, allowing bronzes to be displayed in Nigeria while maintaining European ownership. They propose joint custody arrangements. They suggest creating exact replicas for Nigerian museums while keeping the originals in Europe. Each compromise maintains the fundamental injustice that Europe stole these objects and will not fully return them. A few institutions take a more honest approach. In 2021, Germany announces it will return hundreds of Benin bronzes in its museums. France begins a similar process. These decisions come after decades of pressure from African governments, scholars, and activists. They come after extensive documentation proving these objects were looted, not legally acquired. They acknowledge what should have been obvious from the beginning, that you cannot build museum collections by invading countries and stealing their art. But thousands of Benin bronzes remain in European and American museums. They continue to be displayed with labels that minimize or distort their origins. Many museums still describe them as influenced by European contact, still avoid acknowledging that they were stolen, still present them as curiosities from a primitive culture, rather than masterpieces from a sophisticated civilization. The physical return of the bronzes is important. But equally important is the return of the truth. The acknowledgement that Benin was advanced, that African civilizations developed science, technology, art, and culture independently and sophisticatedly, that the narrative of European superiority was a lie constructed to justify colonialism. That much of what Europe claims as uniquely Western achievement was actually built on knowledge appropriated from other cultures. This truth is slowly emerging, but it faces resistance. Textbooks in Western schools still teach African history as beginning with European colonization. Popular media still portrays pre-colonial Africa as primitive and uncivilized. Museums still organize their African collections to emphasize European influence rather than indigenous achievement. The false narrative persists because it serves a purpose. It allows descendants of colonizers to avoid confronting the full horror of what their ancestors did. In recent years, archaeologists have used new technology to map the full extent of Benin's walls. Using satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar, they have traced the defensive structures across hundreds of miles. The scale is staggering. The earthworks contain more material than the Great Pyramid of Giza. The construction would have required tens of thousands of workers, organized over decades, following a master plan that was executed with remarkable consistency. This was not the work of a primitive society. This required sophisticated project management. Surveying to plan the routes. Engineering to design structures that would remain stable across varied terrain and soil conditions. Labor organization to coordinate massive workforce. Resource management to provide tools, food, and materials to workers over extended periods. Administrative systems to track progress, allocate resources, maintain records. The walls tell a story of a society with the organizational capacity to undertake monumental projects, but they also tell a story of military sophistication. The walls are not just tall, they are strategically designed. Observation posts are positioned at regular intervals, allowing sentries to communicate along the length of the defenses. The walls zigzag in places, creating kill zones where attackers can be caught in crossfire. Gates are angled to prevent direct assault, forcing attackers to approach from exposed directions. This is defensive architecture at a level comparable to European fortifications of the era. It demonstrates understanding of military strategy, of geometry, of structural engineering. It shows that Benin's rulers were thinking not just about defending a single city, but about controlling territory, about creating a defensive network that could protect the entire kingdom. This is strategic thinking on a national scale. Inside the walls, archaeologists have found evidence of industrial production. Sites where iron was smelted in large furnaces, producing metal on a scale that suggests export trade, not just local use. Sites where glass beads were manufactured, detailed chemical analysis shows the glass was made locally using sand and plant ash, not imported from Europe as previously claimed. Sites where pottery was mass-produced in standardized forms, suggesting organized workshops rather than individual household production. This is early industrialization, not at the scale of 19th-century European factories, but showing the same principles: specialization, standardization, organized production. Benin was developing industrial capacity centuries before the Industrial Revolution in Britain. The knowledge systems existed. The organizational capacity existed. What did not exist, because it was not prioritized, was the drive to replace human labor with mechanical power. This was a choice, not a failure of intelligence or capability. The agricultural systems around Benin were equally sophisticated. Farmers practiced crop rotation, preventing soil exhaustion. They understood that certain plants fix nitrogen in soil, improving fertility for subsequent crops. They used terracing on hillsides to prevent erosion. They built irrigation channels to bring water to dry season gardens. They domesticated local plant species, selecting for desirable traits over generations, creating new varieties that were more productive, more resistant to disease, better adapted to local conditions. This is agricultural science. Systematic observation, experimentation, selective breeding. The knowledge might have been expressed in different language than European agricultural manuals, but the underlying principles were the same. understand how plants grow, manipulate conditions to improve yields, preserve and transmit successful techniques. The forest management was particularly sophisticated. The Edo recognized that the forest was a resource that could be depleted if exploited without care. They designated sacred groves where cutting trees was forbidden. These served as wildlife reserves and seed banks, allowing forest species to regenerate. They practiced selective harvesting, taking only mature trees and leaving younger ones to grow. They understood that the forest ecosystem required large predators to prevent herbivore overpopulation, so hunting of leopards and other predators was restricted. These practices maintained forest health for centuries. European colonizers, who viewed the forest as merely a resource to extract, would deplete it within decades, cutting timber for export without replanting, hunting wildlife to near extinction for trophies and sport. The contrast reveals different worldviews. Benin saw humans as part of an ecosystem that required balance, while Europeans saw nature as something to dominate and exploit. The social organization in Benin was complex and, in some ways, surprisingly egalitarian. While the Oba held absolute political authority, the society was not rigidly hierarchical. A person born into a low-status family could rise through exceptional skill. A talented bronze caster could become wealthy and influential. A capable military commander could be appointed to high rank regardless of birth. Merit mattered. Ability mattered. Women held more power in Benin than in most European societies of the era. The Queen Mother, the Oba's mother, was a major political figure with her own palace and court. Women controlled certain markets, particularly those dealing in agricultural products. Women could own property, conduct business, inherit wealth. They were not property of their husbands, and divorce was possible under certain circumstances. This was far more progressive than European societies, where women could not own property, could not conduct business without male permission, and had essentially no legal rights independent of fathers or husbands. The legal system was sophisticated. There were established courts, formalized procedures for hearing disputes, a body of customary law that was known and applied consistently. Punishments were calibrated to offenses. Minor crimes received minor penalties. Serious crimes received harsh ones. The Oba served as final judge in important cases, but most disputes were handled at lower levels by appointed officials who specialized in legal matters. This was not arbitrary rule by a tyrant. This was a functioning legal system with principles, procedures, and institutional structures. It was comparable to legal systems in Europe, and in some ways more consistent and predictable, since it was not fragmented across dozens of feudal lords, each applying their own interpretations of law. The destruction of Benin in 1897 reverberated across Africa. Other kingdoms watched and understood the message. Resistance was futile. European powers had overwhelming military superiority. They would use that superiority without hesitation or mercy. They would destroy anyone who refused to submit. Within 20 years, nearly all of Africa would be under colonial control. The era of independent African kingdoms was ending. But the memory persisted. The elders told stories to their children about the time before the Europeans, when great kingdoms ruled, when African kings negotiated with European traders as equals, when African cities were marvels of architecture and planning. These stories were dismissed by colonial educators as fantasies, as African people mythologizing a past that never existed. But the stories were true. The evidence was still there, hidden in ruins, buried in the earth, locked away in European museums. In the independence era of the 1950s and 60s, these stories became politically powerful. African leaders used the memory of great pre-colonial kingdoms to build national identity, to argue that Africans were capable of self-governance, to counter the colonial narrative that portrayed colonialism as a civilizing force. Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, Julius Nyerere in Tanzania, Nnamdi Azikiwe in Nigeria, all invoked the legacy of African civilizations to legitimize their independence movements. But the truth about places like Benin was still suppressed in the West. History textbooks continued to present a narrative where Africa had no significant civilizations before European contact. Geography textbooks described Africa as undeveloped, primitive, tribal. Popular culture presented Africa as the dark continent, a place of jungles and savages, not cities and scientists. This narrative was never benign. It had real consequences. It shaped foreign policy. Western governments felt justified in supporting dictators in Africa because Africans were deemed incapable of democracy. It shaped development aid. Western organizations imposed solutions designed in Europe rather than working with existing African knowledge systems. It shaped immigration policy. African immigrants were viewed with suspicion and prejudice, seen as coming from inferior cultures. It shaped everyday racism. The stereotype of the primitive African justified discrimination in housing, employment, education. The fight to correct this narrative has been long and difficult. African scholars have led the way, but they have faced institutional resistance. Universities in Europe and America have been slow to incorporate African history into curricula. Publishers have been reluctant to produce textbooks that challenge the established narrative. Museums have resisted changing their exhibitions to acknowledge the sophistication of African civilizations. But gradually, the truth has spread. Archaeological discoveries continue to confirm what oral histories claimed, that Africa had sophisticated civilizations with advanced technology, complex social organization, and rich cultural achievements. DNA analysis has proven that the Benin bronzes were made with African materials by African craftsmen, demolishing the theories about European influence. Historical research has documented the extent of African scientific knowledge in metallurgy, agriculture, medicine, astronomy. The story of Benin has become emblematic. It represents the larger pattern of how European colonialism operated, not just through military conquest, but through cultural erasure. Destroying cities was not enough. Looting art was not enough. The history itself had to be erased, replaced with a narrative that justified the conquest retrospectively. If Africans were primitive, then colonialism was justified. If Africa had no civilization, then Europe was bringing civilization, not destroying it. This lie was systematic and intentional. It was taught in schools, preached in churches, published in books and newspapers. It became the common sense understanding of Africa in the West, and it persists today, in subtler forms, but still present in how Africa is perceived, discussed, and treated. The return of the Benin bronzes is not just about returning stolen property. It is about correcting the historical record. It is about acknowledging that the narrative taught in Western schools was false. It is about recognizing that European dominance was not inevitable or deserved, that it came through violence and theft, and that the civilizations it destroyed were sophisticated, valuable, and worthy of respect. Nigeria has announced plans to build a new museum in Benin City to house the returned bronzes and other artifacts of the kingdom's history. The museum will be designed by African architects using modern technology, but incorporating elements of traditional Benin architecture. It will tell the story of the kingdom's rise, its achievements, its destruction, and its ongoing cultural legacy. It will serve as a reminder of what was lost and what endures. But physical objects, even precious cultural treasures, are not the deepest loss. The deeper loss is knowledge. The bronze casters who died in 1897 took their techniques with them. The astronomers who calculated the angles of the gates. The doctors who knew which plant combinations cured which diseases. The engineers who designed the walls. Their knowledge was not written in books that could be preserved. It was in their minds, transmitted orally through years of apprenticeship. When they died without apprentices, that knowledge was lost. Some of it can be reconstructed. Modern scientists can analyze the bronze alloys, figure out the casting temperatures, replicate the techniques, but some of it is gone forever. The specific details, the refinements developed over generations, the accumulated wisdom that cannot be reverse-engineered from the final products. This is the true crime of cultural genocide. It is not just killing people, it is killing knowledge. It is severing the chain of transmission that carries learning across generations. It is destroying the possibility that future generations will build on what previous generations discovered. It is erasing entire branches of human achievement, making it as if they never existed. Modern Benin City is a growing metropolis, home to over 1 million people. It is the capital of Edo State in southern Nigeria. The streets are busy with traffic, the markets crowded with vendors, the air filled with the sounds of a vibrant urban center. But traces of the old kingdom remain. Sections of the ancient walls still stand, though they are now surrounded by modern buildings. The royal palace has been rebuilt, and the current Oba continues the lineage that stretches back centuries, serving as a cultural and ceremonial leader if no longer a political ruler. Some of the old traditions survive. The guild system, though not as formal as it once was, still exists in modified form. Bronze casters in Benin City still practice their craft, though they now create pieces for the tourist market and art collectors rather than for the royal court. Some are direct descendants of the master craftsmen of the Old Kingdom, carrying on family traditions that survived despite the disruption of colonialism. In workshops scattered through the city, these craftsmen use techniques passed down through families. They still use lost wax casting, though now they have access to modern tools and materials that make some steps easier. They still create intricate works that demonstrate the high level of skill that has always characterized Benin metalwork. They are living proof that the knowledge, though damaged, was not entirely lost. There is a cultural revival happening in Benin City and across Nigeria. Young people are researching their history, learning about the achievements of their ancestors, reclaiming the narrative that colonialism tried to erase. Artists are creating works that draw on traditional Benin aesthetics while engaging with contemporary themes. Musicians are incorporating traditional instruments and rhythms into modern genres. Scholars are documenting oral histories before the last elders who remember the old stories pass away. This revival is not about recreating the past. Benin City will not return to being a pre-colonial kingdom. The world has changed too much. But it is about knowing the past, about understanding that the current state of Africa, with its poverty, its conflicts, its challenges, is not the natural condition of African people. It is the result of specific historical processes: slavery, colonialism, exploitation, underdevelopment enforced by external powers. Knowing the history of places like Benin changes how Africans see themselves and how the world sees Africa. It demonstrates that African people built sophisticated civilizations, that they have a long history of innovation and achievement, that they were not sitting in darkness waiting for Europeans to bring them enlightenment. It proves that the poverty and underdevelopment in modern Africa is not due to lack of capability, but to centuries of exploitation and continuing economic systems that extract wealth from Africa to enrich other regions. This knowledge is empowering. It counters the internalized racism that colonialism created, the belief among some Africans that they are inferior, that their cultures are worthless, that anything valuable must come from outside. It provides a foundation for cultural pride and self-determination. It suggests that African solutions to African problems, drawing on African knowledge and experience, might be more effective than imported Western models that often fail to account for local conditions. The story of Benin also challenges the historical narrative in the West. It forces a reckoning with what colonialism actually was. Not a civilizing mission, but cultural destruction. Not development, but extraction. Not education, but erasure. The comfortable story that Western school children are taught, that Europeans brought progress to primitive peoples, cannot survive honest examination of places like Benin. This is why the fight over the Benin bronzes matters so much. It is not really about the objects themselves, though they are precious. It is about which narrative prevails. The colonial narrative that says these objects are better off in European museums because Africans cannot properly care for them. Or the post-colonial narrative that says these objects were stolen during an unjust invasion and should be returned to the people whose ancestors created them. The same fight is happening over other looted cultural heritage. The Parthenon marbles taken from Greece and held in the British Museum, the Rosetta Stone taken from Egypt, countless objects taken from Asia, the Americas, the Pacific. European museums are filled with treasures acquired during the colonial era, and increasingly, people in the source countries are demanding their return. Museums resist because returning objects means acknowledging that they were stolen. It means admitting that much of European cultural wealth was built on theft. It means losing prestigious artifacts that draw visitors and donors. It means confronting the uncomfortable truth that institutions held in high regard. The British Museum, the Louvre, the Metropolitan Museum are storing vast quantities of stolen property. But the pressure is building. International law is evolving to recognize that cultural heritage belongs to originating peoples. Public opinion, especially among younger generations, is shifting to support repatriation. Some museums are beginning to acknowledge the problematic origins of their collections and to engage in genuine dialogue about how to address historical injustices. The process is slow and frustrating, but it represents a broader shift in how the world understands colonialism. For most of the 20th century, even as colonies gained political independence, the cultural and economic structures of colonialism persisted. Western institutions maintained authority over how non-Western cultures were interpreted and presented. Western economic systems continued to extract resources from former colonies. Western military power continued to intervene in former colonial territories. This is changing. Not quickly, not completely, but changing nonetheless. Countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America are asserting their own narratives, building their own institutions, creating alternative economic systems. They are challenging Western dominance, not just politically, but culturally and intellectually. They are reclaiming their histories from the distortions imposed by colonialism. The story of Benin is ultimately about knowledge and power. Knowledge is power. This is not just a saying, but a fundamental truth. The knowledge that Benin was advanced, that Africa had sophisticated civilizations, that European dominance was not inevitable. This knowledge challenges the power structures built on the narrative of Western superiority. For centuries, Western powers controlled the narrative. They wrote the history books, ran the museums, dominated academic institutions. They decided what counted as civilization, what counted as knowledge, what counted as achievement. And they consistently defined these terms to favor Western cultures and exclude or minimize others. But knowledge cannot be completely suppressed. Archaeological evidence sits in the ground, waiting to be discovered. Oral traditions persist in communities, passed down generation after generation. The objects themselves, like the Benin bronzes, contain evidence of their origins that scientific analysis can reveal. Truth has a way of emerging, even when powerful institutions try to bury it. The digital age has accelerated this process. Information that once required access to specialized archives is now available online. Scholars from formerly colonized countries can conduct research and publish findings without needing approval from Western academic gatekeepers. Social media allows alternative narratives to spread rapidly, reaching global audiences. Young people around the world are encountering histories that their textbooks omitted. This democratization of knowledge is disrupting old hierarchies. The Western monopoly on interpreting human history is breaking down. African scholars are writing African history. Asian scholars are writing Asian history. Indigenous scholars are writing indigenous history. And they are telling stories that complicate and challenge the neat narratives of Western superiority and inevitable progress. The resistance to these alternative narratives is intense. Conservative politicians in Western countries are fighting against what they call critical race theory or woke history, labels they apply to any teaching that acknowledges the realities of colonialism, slavery, and cultural destruction. They want to return to the comfortable myths where Western civilization is the pinnacle of human achievement and other cultures are interesting but ultimately inferior. But this resistance is ultimately futile. The evidence is too strong. The voices are too many. The demand for truth is too powerful. Future generations will know what happened. They will know that places like Benin existed, that they were sophisticated and advanced, that they were destroyed, not because they were inferior, but because they stood in the way of European extraction of resources and wealth. They will know that much of what is presented as Western achievement was built on appropriated knowledge from other cultures. That European Renaissance art was influenced by contact with African and Asian artists. That European science built on mathematical discoveries from the Islamic world and India. That European wealth came from resources extracted from colonized territories, often using forced labor. They will understand that human achievement is not the property of any one culture or race. That innovation happens everywhere. That brilliance exists in all populations. That the current global hierarchy of power and wealth is a historical contingency, not a reflection of inherent superiority. This understanding will change the world. It will make it harder to justify continued exploitation of former colonies. It will undermine racist ideologies that claim some peoples are naturally superior to others. It will create space for diverse approaches to human challenges, drawing on knowledge systems from around the world, rather than assuming Western ways are always best. The Benin bronzes, when they finally return home, will be more than art objects. They will be symbols of this larger transformation. They will represent the reclaiming of African history from those who stole and distorted it. They will stand as evidence that Africa was never the dark continent, never primitive, never waiting for outside civilization. Africa had its own light, its own civilization, its own genius. And that truth, suppressed for centuries, is now impossible to deny. In Benin City, in the museum that is being planned, visitors will walk through galleries displaying the bronzes alongside contemporary explanations of how they were made, what they represented, how they fit into the larger kingdom's culture and history. They will see architectural models showing how the city was laid out, with its precise grid, its massive walls, its astronomical alignments. They will learn about the guild system, the medical knowledge, the metallurgical science. They will encounter a civilization that was sophisticated, complex, and advanced by any reasonable definition. And they will learn about the destruction, about how this civilization was intentionally erased, about how the evidence was looted and then used to prove the opposite of what it actually demonstrated, about how history was rewritten to justify conquest retrospectively, about how knowledge was stolen and then the theft denied. This is the story that needs to be told, not just in Benin, but everywhere, in every school, every museum, every history book. Because until this story is told honestly, until the full truth about colonialism is acknowledged, the structures built on colonial lies will persist. The inequalities, the racism, the exploitation, they all rest on the foundation of a false history that claims European dominance was natural and deserved. Dismantling that false history is the work of this generation and the next. It requires returning stolen objects. It requires rewriting textbooks. It requires changing museum exhibitions. It requires honest acknowledgement from institutions that benefited from colonialism. It requires apologies, reparations, systemic change. It is uncomfortable work. It challenges deeply held beliefs. It requires people who have benefited from the current system to acknowledge that their advantages came at the expense of others. It means giving up power, wealth, and prestige that feel earned, but were actually built on historical injustice. But it is necessary work, because the alternative is to perpetuate the lie, to continue teaching false histories that distort how we understand the world, to maintain systems of inequality built on foundations of theft and violence, to deny the truth that the ruins, the artifacts, the evidence all clearly demonstrate, that the Kingdom of Benin was a great civilization, that its destruction was a tragedy, and that the story we have been told about Africa and Europe, about civilization and savagery, about superiority and inferiority, was always a lie constructed to justify the unjustifiable. The truth is emerging, slowly, against resistance, but unstoppably. And when it is finally widely known, when the story of Benin and hundreds of other African civilizations is taught as standard history, when the Benin bronzes and countless other looted treasures return to their homes, when the full accounting of colonialism is made, then, perhaps, we can begin to build a more honest world. One where all peoples are recognized for their achievements, where histories are told truthfully, where the future is built on acknowledgement of the past, rather than continued denial of it. That world is not here yet, but the kingdom of Benin, in its ruins and its surviving art, in its documented achievements and its stolen treasures, stands as evidence that such a world is possible, that human brilliance exists everywhere, that civilization is not the monopoly of any one culture, and that truth, no matter how long it is suppressed, will eventually prevail.